I still remember the smell of wet fur and smoke that night, a copper taste at the back of my tongue, like a promise and a threat at once. The torchlight outside made the cottage walls breathe in slow orange waves, and the wind carried the laugh of strangers and the low, steady roll of distant drums. I sat on the earthen floor with my knees pulled to my chest, feeling the grit under my palms, the rough weave of my tunic scratching my wrists, the pendant cool and oddly heavy against my skin. My mother's hand was warm and strong as she tucked a blanket tighter around my shoulders. "Do not move," she whispered, her voice bright as a match struck in the dark. She pressed something shaped like a claw, carved from bone and tied with silver thread, into my palm, and the carvings dug into my skin the way truth digs in. "Remember who we are," she said. Her breath smelled of rosemary and worry, and when she kissed my forehead, the scent imprinted like a map I could not unsee. Outside, the drums rose and fell like tides, a cadence that pulled at my ribs. I told myself they would pass us by, that the road would take them to other doors. Maybe they would choose another. Maybe my smallness would keep me hidden. I imagined them finding a prettier face, a more useful family, someone who wore silk, not patched wool. For a moment, my fear softened into a secret hope. Then the knocking came, a heavy, deliberate knock that shook the plaster from the walls. Boots sounded in the yard, heavy leather dragging over stone. The door flew open and torchlight cut the room into lines of exposure. Tall men filled the threshold, and a voice came in clipped and spare. "Elena of the Hollow," it said. My name landed like ice. My mother made a sound that was part prayer and part breaking. She pushed a small bundle into my arms, things to sustain a travel that I had never taken alone, and with her other hand, she closed my fingers over the bone pendant. "If they ask you who you are, tell them the truth," she said. "Say you belong to us. Say my name." I called back to her 100 things I did not say. "There is a mistake, and I cannot go, and I will fight you," none of which mattered. They had already written my fate on a list somewhere, and the list had the weight of mountains. They came with a proclamation and eyes like winter. The man at the front wore a cloak threaded with silver, his face half shadow and half scar. He bowed once to my mother, as if she were a footnote, and then turned to me. "The Lycan king summons a consort," he announced. The words moved through me like a wind that tore at curtains. A consort, a title that belonged to songs and stories, to the high houses we whispered about and then tried to forget. I could feel the pendant on my palm as something alive. Whatever it promised, I understood that night that thorns and flowers come from the same stem. We had 10 minutes, 10 heated breaths to say goodbyes. My mother braided my hair with more care than she had used in years and pressed a folded scrap of paper into my fist, something she had written with a trembling hand. "For when you do not know the way," she said. I kissed her fingers, afraid that the touch would be the last map I had of home. The road swallowed us under a sky full of indifferent stars. The journey to the northern hold was a first lesson in how small I was to the world. The dirt road turned to stone, then to ice, and black pines leaned over us like old judges. The carriage smelled of hay, horse sweat, and a faint undertone of metal used to bind the world together. I clutched the pendant until the silver thread cut lines into my palm, feeling the rhythm of the horses through my bones, the way the ground seemed to hold secrets under every wheel. I dozed and woke with the taste of smoke and old bread, watching strangers' mouths move in low talk, catching flashes of names I would have to learn. The road became a lesson in listening. Through the small crack in a carriage panel, I memorized accents and timbres, the way voices told you who they trusted and who they feared. When they led me to the hold at dawn, My eyes stung from the dry cold. The fortress sat on a cliff like a thing carved from storm. Its walls were not smooth stones, but bones of the mountain, pocked and weathered, banners snapping like tongues at the edge. The air smelled of iron and pine resin, and a far-off tang of blood that belonged to hunting grounds I had not yet seen. Guards in leather and fur intersected the courtyards with a confidence I envied, steps sure as tides. There were faces in the crowd that watched me as you watch a page in a book that could change your favorite line. Elder Mira stepped forward, a woman whose hair had been white when my mother was a child, and she touched the pendant on my chest with fingers that had lived with many such choices. "You carry the mark of the hollow," she said, naming a place I recognized and had thought insignificant. "The king wants not just lineage, but a mind that remembers the old things." I should say something here about why I, of all people, was chosen. I will not spend too long confessing pride. What I can say is this. My childhood was a small archive of survival. I learned to mend torn sleeves before I learned to read the names of stars. I learned to listen to the wind and name storms by their first breath. I learned to taste the river and tell where the stones would be treacherous and where the fish would be fat. I learned to read silence better than speech, because silence tells you what people fear. My father had been a woodsman who died in an accident whose details my mother does not allow us to speak aloud. My mother taught me herbs and how to make poultices, how to hold a fever steady without letting it steer the patient into worse places. I had a brother once, Leaf, who left for the city and promised to return with a ledger and never did. We were a family of small certainties. Then one autumn, a traveler left a book at our table, a slim thing about old rites and the language of wolves. I read it in secret by candlelight, learning names that felt like spells. I learned that being ordinary can sometimes be the very reason a door opens, because the powerful sometimes need someone who remembers that common things contain invisible structures. That is my backstory in 3 pieces. It is not glamorous. It is the bedrock that makes me sensible to the Lycan hold. The first time I saw him alone, he did not wear a crown. He stood by a hearth within the inner hall, a living shadow in the glow, and when he turned, I felt the air change in my lungs. He was taller than the stories made him, with shoulders broad as a barn door, and his hair was the color of night with threads of silver running like river veins. His eyes were a green that startled you into honesty, like the raw inside of a gem. He smiled once, a slow peeling back of something that had been held back by habit and duty. "Do not run from me," he said the second night, a rumble that was more whisper than threat. The words did not scare me because they were meant to hold me, not to chase me away. Our first private meeting was small and long, like the gentle threading of a seam. He entered the chamber and closed the door with a soft click that sounded like a promise. The room was a map of smells. Faint smoke, the oil of lamp wicks, the leather of a chair, the sweet metallic memory of dried herbs. He sat first and watched me as if he were reading a page I had yet to write. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and the pendant warm against my sternum. I tried to breathe without betraying that my heart had rearranged itself into a different beat. "Elena," he said, testing my name as if it were clay. "You came far." "I did," I answered, and my voice sounded like a small tool against an iron gate. He asked questions that were both ordinary and—
"Why did your father become a woodsman? What did you dream of when you were 9? Can you stand still while someone else breathes around you?" I answered because I had to, because speech anchors you to reality when it begins to slip. There were moments of silence that felt like the listening of a large animal. He told me small things. "I prefer the north wind," he said. "It tells the truth more plainly than the south." I told him about the book and how I came to know old rites. He listened with his jaw unclenched, the way people listen when they mean to carry a confession. At one point, he reached across the table and placed a hand, rough and warm, over mine. "You fear for your mother," he observed, and I nearly told him the truth then, that my mother was the last map I allowed myself to trust. Instead, I said, "I fear that being here is theft." He laughed once, the sound like pebbles crossing a wooden floor. "On some nights you will steal safety, on others you will offer it." His fingers tightened, and he added, "I will not ask you to betray yourself." The refusal for me to be anything but myself was a request that felt like an order from a benevolent god. Our conversation lasted until the light thinned to gray and then to a deeper blue that held the promise of the moon. We spoke of hunting grounds and of treaties and of small things he missed from childhood. He told me the names of his advisers: Marcellus the scribe, who loved old maps; Captain Jory, who slept with his sword on his bed; Keeper Oren, who read the language of wolves; Thomas the stablemaster, who smelled like wet hay; and Anya, who tended the king's garments and could mend a tear without seamstress tools. He named them without ceremony, as if listing them armed me with an inventory. That first private meeting was a weave of tests. He watched me unravel, then watched me stitch myself back together. When he asked me to walk with him through the outer courtyard, I could hear the court as a separate organism. The scent of raw meat from the kitchens, the metallic tang of horse breath, the pine smoke from the guards' torches, the grit of the earth underfoot, and the far hollow call of wolves that echoed from the hunting grounds. He slowed his pace to mine and asked, gently, "Do you believe in the old bonds?" I thought of my pendant and my mother tying words into my hand. "I believe in what holds us," I said. He smiled then, and there was gratitude like rain. The palace life arrived in stages, like a tide that covers a beach. I was shown my rooms, which smelled of beeswax and cedar, soft cloths they called fine, but which felt coarse to me at first. Servants whose names I learned.
And repeated became my chorus. Anya taught me how to sit at the high table, how to fold a spoon without the right hand blush, how to keep my voice small when powerful folk debate. Tomas brought me to the stables and let me run my fingers over a mare's flank, feeling muscle under a sheen of sweat, smelling the animal's breath like sweet hay and peppermint. It was humiliating and freeing, the way a new language humbles you and makes you human again. Then came the banquet that tested everything in daylight. The great hall yawned with banners and a heat of bodies. Food steamed in iron platters. The scent of roasted venison filled the rafters, mingling with wine that burned at the edges and wax that ran like slow lava down candlesticks. People I had only glimpsed in shadows now stood in embroidered splendor, collars high, jewels like small suns. Lady Rhiannon arrived like a storm in silk. She wore a crown of thin gold and smelled faintly of citrus and scorn. Her son Lysander, handsome as carved marble, took our table like a claim. Their eyes were calculating, ready to measure a newcomer like a blade. I felt their judgment as if it were a cold wind running along my spine. Lady Rhiannon made a small speech about traditions and the rights of old houses, and in the half-light she called me out with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "We trust our bonds to those who understand lineage," she said, every word a thin bead of acid. Around the table, heads turned the way birds turn. Murmurs rippled like a pond. I could smell fear in the room then, undercurrents of perfume and oil and old leather. The king, seated tall and unassuming, did not look startled. He raised a cup and looked directly at me. "Tell us," he said. My mouth went dry. The sound of the crowd sucked into a thin tube. I set the pendant over the table between my palms and felt the wood tremble against my skin. "I offer knowledge of the land," I said, my voice a rope I pulled tight.
I offer hands that mend and ears that hear." Lady Rhiannon laughed in a way that cut the linen. "Hands and ears do not hold power," she said, her words soft but precise. Lysander added, "We need someone who understands court, not a girl who stitches hides." The barbs stung, but the king set down his cup and rose. "Jumping to taunt a guest does not make one noble," he said, his voice carrying like a bell. He stepped closer to the table, and the hall seemed to tilt. "If you would speak for yourself, then speak." I defended myself because there was no other option. Words came in a flurry. "You speak as if lineage alone protects a realm," I said, and although the room wanted me tiny, the words escaped like a net. The land remembers those who listen. A treaty is not only ink, it is soil and memory. I grew up on the edges of maps. I know the names of stones the court forgot. My speech was small and direct, and it landed without show. Two people in the crowd, Tomas and Captain Jory, nodded. Elder Mira, near the high table, made a small sound that could have been a prayer or a chuckle. The king smiled in a quiet way that made the warmth in my chest extend to my fingers. Lady Rhiannon reddened, her smile slipping into a line. That night, when I returned to my chamber, the king came again. The private meetings became a ritual of their own, a careful pulling of threads. He spoke of the territory that lay to the east, of border disputes, of wolves that had been seen crossing lines they never did before. He spoke of a council, of Marcellus the scribe who favored archives over blood, of Keeper Orin who insisted the pack must listen to the old ways. I learned how their politics moved like rivers under ice, slow and fatal if you stepped wrong. The court had factions. Some looked kindly on a consort who could speak with border folk. Others wanted a consort who would cement old pacts with polished promises and silver rings. Rhiannon pushed for a union that kept her house closer to the throne. There was a map of loyalties written in glances and small gestures. It did not take long before tension braided into danger. A week into my time there, I found a cup placed near my bed that smelled faintly of bitter almond. It could have been coincidence. It could have been a poor maid who forgot to clear the table. But the smell made my tongue numb for a moment, and the pendant burned like a coal against my skin. Keeper Orin, who visited me under the pretense of teaching about the old rites, read the cup like a sorcerer reads runes. He set the cup into a bowl of steaming water and watched the steam smoke and curl. "Not all poisons reveal themselves in the same way," he said, tapping his nose with a finger stained in herb ash. He explained, in a spare way that did not comfort, that certain toxins bind to proteins and leave a metallic tang that lingers only on the breath. He had a method, a short technique he described as if reciting an incantation. He placed a drop of the cup into a heated spoon and watched it blacken, then mixed a scrap of silver into the residue. The silver changed hue when in contact with alkaloids in a way the naked eye could only faintly see. The pattern was old, practical, and required steady hands. His explanation ran about 3 sentences, and then he said, "We will not leave this unchecked." That technical disclosure was small, but enough to set plans in motion. It was clear someone in court wanted outcomes decided without consent. We moved into protective measures, almost as if a fog rolled in. Captain Jory doubled the guard near my rooms. Tomas began sleeping near the stables with a blade he did not use for horses, leatheries and tar making his hands rough. Marcellus pored over records, his spectacles sliding down the bridge of his nose as he cross-referenced supply lists and guest rosters. Keeper Orin called the wolves to scent the air, and their howls told ancient things only the hills could translate. He said that sometimes enemies mark places with certain herbs, the kind that attract rust and delay iron.
The discovery of a planned poisoning turned whispers into tactics. We started rehearsals for the ceremony of choosing with more intensity. The king insisted I learn the formalities of the ritual, the movement of the robes, the cadence of the vows, the way hands lay upon altars that smelled of stone and moonlight. These lessons were a kind of armor. The days until the ceremony became compressed with private moments. In the quiet between training and strategy, the king and I discovered a rhythm not spoken about in court. We walked the ramparts at dawn, when the world had a fine silver on it, and he would tell me the names of herbs he remembered from his childhood. He showed me a scar on his palm that matched the line of a river. We argued sometimes about the right words to choose in public, and sometimes about the right way to tie a knot. There were moments when his hand found mine in the dark, and the touch was no longer a test, but a safety. I learned the subtle language of his gaze, how it softened when he listened to an elder, and how it sharpened when he was preparing for debate. There were nights we lay in his chamber and watched the moon make small shadows on the floor, and in those hours the court was distant, like an animal sleeping at the edge of the village. He told me pieces of history that did not make it into formal records, tales of frontier mending done by people whose names had been erased. All the while Lady Rhiannon watched. Her barbs slid into the court like thin knives, and Lysander grew impatient and mean. There was a pressure building, the way ice thickens before it cracks. The council convened to discuss border taxes and new patrols, and I sat in a corner, a figure meant to be ornamental and perhaps to lean into the king's image. Instead, I started to point to small details, logistical things that only someone who walked the paths could identify. Marcellus, gracious in the way of scholars who enjoy being right, took note. Captain Jory grunted and eyed my maps. The more I provided, the more certain factions pressed on their own agendas. Alliances changed. Like weather. The night before the choice ceremony disaster almost found its teeth. A messenger arrived breathless and pale, carrying a torn letter that hinted at a rival house moving troops along the border. The writing was smudged by rain and haste. Rhiannon moves in the east, the messenger said, eyes wide as stones. Her men gather near the old crossing. The court fell into a clamor. The king did not shout. He folded the letter with careful fingers and then looked at me. "We have a choice to make," he said, a sentence that could have been about war or about what to eat. He asked for my counsel in the council, a simple asking that made everyone still. I spoke of patrol patterns, of night watch rotations, of who to send to the bridges. I used details Thomas had shown me in the stables, and Captain Jory adapted them. For the first time, I felt the attention of the room, as if it were warmth, not threat. Then came the final night, the ceremony itself. The hall where it was held smelled of beeswax, cold stone, and the faint metallic tang that had haunted the edges of my life since we discovered the cup. Torches guttered low, offering light the way a hand offers a map. The chamber thrummed with the presence of people, the scraping of chairs, the rustle of heavy robes. There were drums set around the ceremonial pool that reflected the moon, and the water held the sky in a bowl. The ritual required us to walk the circumference of that pool, to touch the surface with our bare hands, and to speak promises in the old tongue that binds pack to sovereign. The words tasted of iron and peat when I practiced them. Keeper Orin had taught me the cadence. "Let the water remember," he had said. "Let the water witness." There was a small technical piece to the ritual, a procedure I had to learn with care. One part required that the hands be washed in 3 washes, each with different herbs. First with rue to remind of caution, then with lavender to bring clarity to words, and finally with nettle to fortify the skin against deceit. The order is important because each herb has a chemical reaction with sweat residue that changes the salinity of the water slightly, and the elders read that shift with their fingers. It is old practice, practical, and symbolic, and it calmed me when I performed it by the pool. Lady Rhiannon tried to orchestrate a spectacle.
She timed her accusations to land like pebbles. She stood then and spoke, weaving a story of lineage and duty, and when she pivoted her voice to me, she offered false courtesy. A consort must represent the court, she said. She must be the image we parade to other holds. The drums hit a slow, steady beat. Headed by Marcellus, and with Captain Jory observing the entrance, the king took my hand, and together we walked the edge of the pool. The scent of water, of cold stone, of smoke from a torch carried at the high table, the whisper of robes brushing the floor, the leathery tang of guards around us, the breath of the crowd mixing with the night, these were the sensory threads of the ceremony. The ritual asked a question in the silence after the vows. It asked not only whether I accepted, but whether I understood the reach of the role. There was a moment where I felt the pendant on my chest hum like a small answering drum, and for an instant the past and future overlapped like two transparent maps. The king looked at me with a steadiness that acted as a kind of oath. Then he did something unexpected. Instead of choosing by decree, he stepped forward, lowered his voice, and spoke my token phrase into my ear, the one my mother had taught me not as a secret, but as a covenant. "By what we are and what we keep," he said quietly, and then he addressed the court in a voice that was neither high nor low, but absolutely present. "By the measure of deeds and the memory of land, I choose Elena of the Hollow as my consort." Gasps fluttered. Lady Rhiannon's face became the color of old silk pushed under the sun. Lysander's jaw clicked. Some applauded politely. Keeper Oren closed his eyes in relief, and the wolves howled outside, a sound like a tide breaking. It was not only a choice of heart, but a political move that unsettled established ambitions. But more than politics, there was the private binding that happened at the pool when we vowed. We did not speak of ownership, we spoke of guardianship. I pressed my hand into the water and felt it swallow the warmth and then return it as cool approval. He placed his hand over mine, and the water did not part. He carried a faint smell of the hunt and pine smoke into the stillness, and in that small communion, something larger was sealed. There were consequences that came quickly. Rhiannon withdrew her public smile, but did not retreat entirely. She began plotting in the way that storms gather in silence. We found a letter sewn into a servant's cloak that outlined a rent in the militia the day of a border crossing. Lysander tried to duel Captain Jory in a display meant to shame the captain and discredit our faction. Marcellus stood with papers answered by signatures of men whose loyalties had been bought and paid in promises. There were nights of whispered meetings and sharp words in corridors. The pack strengthened its outer watches and reworked patrols around the eastern crossing. We, the king and I, spent long hours reviewing barters and alliances, balancing public vows and private security. I found in the king a tenacity that had nothing to do with brute force and everything to do with the patient application of power. He would wait, set a subtle trap, and then present a solution when the opposing faction had shown its hand. Politics, I discovered, is a form of hunting where patience is the net. 2 intense moments of tension came that could have undone everything. The first was a night when a small group, masked and swift, attempted to slip into the stables and set fire to the winter stores. Tomas discovered them, and a fight spilled onto the frozen courtyard. The second was a whisper unfurled into an attempted assassination at the Festival of the Moon. Both times I felt memory like a hand on my shoulder, old training that told me when to run and when to stand. The fight at the stables lasted only a few breaths, but felt like a long lesson. I ran into the fray and threw a bucket, the cold water hitting a cloak and dimming the spark. My hands smelled of smoke and fear and oats and the small copper of a bloodied lip. In the festival attempt, a dagger found its way close enough that the king's scarf caught the edge, ripping fabric and skin. Keeper Oren, who moves with the quiet speed of someone who has listened to wolves, was there with a blade and a precise strike. Captain Jory and Tomas held the line, their sweat mixing with the cloy of the crowd.
In those hours, choices made in haste and choices made by design braided together. I felt my chest churn with adrenaline and a clarity that was almost cruel. We interrogated a servant and named several conspirators. The trail led inexorably toward a faction aligned with Rhiannon. The evidence came in small, careful pieces: a ledger with payments, a charred ribbon, and a confession that arrived more from fear than loyalty. When they finally presented the evidence in the council, the room smelled like ink, blood, and the citrus of Rhiannon's perfumes. She denied everything with a grace that made a viper seem tender. The council convened, and Marcellus read aloud the findings. There was an attempt to influence militia at the Eastern Crossing, he said, his voice meticulous. Payments were made to mercenaries who then staged disruptions. The accusation was precise, and the way it landed made a part of the court quietly choose a side. Rhiannon, confronted, had less room to maneuver. She retreated into the crocodile calm of someone who knows how to survive a storm. The final formal choice returned to the court with a ceremonious cadence. The king, by public proclamation, declared reforms to the border patrols, promised new duties to houses who would accept them, and set down a vow to consult border folk in decisions that impacted their land. My voice, once small, was given slender weight. I proposed a network of sentinels drawn from border families, paid by the crown, and a registry that Keeper Oren would keep with Marcellus. The reforms were not universally loved, but they were just. The point was not a final victory, but a rebalancing. Politics does not end in victory. It evolves into agreements that look fragile but hold. A week after the ceremony, I remember standing on the rampart with the pendant warm against my throat. The moon carved a path of silver over the snow. The king came and wrapped me in cloak, an action that worked like a map folding. He did not say, "Do not run from me" that night. Instead, he said, quieter and more urgent, "Stay because you choose to." I had thought at the beginning that being chosen meant being taken. Now I felt that being chosen could mean being invited into a shared purpose, which is a very different thing. I thought of my mother's hand, of the smell of rosemary and smoke, of all the small things that had rooted me. I also knew the crown was heavy in ways I could not have guessed. It pressed into decisions like frost presses into a field. But under the weight, there was a strange buoyancy, as if being seen finally allowed me to breathe. 1 month later, life had shifted, but not entirely rearranged. The reforms began to roll out. We established a registry and started paying sentinels, many of whom were kinfolk of mine and Thomas's acquaintances. There was grumbling in some houses. Rhiannon kept a courteous face while her son brooded with the silent malice of a cat denied a meal. Keeper Oren sent wolves to test the eastern paths, and their tracks came back like stamps of approval. I spent my afternoons in the practical work of the hold, helping where I could with maps and listening to people who had been ignored. My mother wrote a letter that came with the smell of rosemary and warm bread. In it, she told me of a sapling that had started behind our cottage, a small green thing that seemed determined to grow in stony soil. It became a symbol for us. The people at the border began to look at me not only as a consort, but as someone who remembered what they smelled like, who knew the names of their crossings, who had not left their language behind. 3 months on, my presence altered things that are slow to change. The registry of sentinels reduced petty raids and improved trade at the old crossing by making routes safer. Marcellus compiled a ledger that recorded not only names, but stories, notes that gave context to family ties and minor grievances. Thomas and Captain Jory worked together to form a rotating watch, and their cooperation calmed old rivalries. There were moments of tenderness, too. The king and I carved out spaces for private conversation, and I learned that his public stoicism hid memories of childhood loneliness. He confessed once to missing the ordinary sound of rain on a roof, a small thing that made him, in a way, easier to love. Lady Rhiannon's power was dampened not by a single blow, but by the steady accretion of small bureaucratic fixes and the building of new alliances. The court grew quieter, the way a forest regains the old paths after a storm. We celebrated small harvests and mourned trivial losses, and in them there was the recognition that life persists, whether sovereign or subject. 6 months later, the hold felt less like an imposition on my life and more like an extension of what I had always been. The pendant, now worn in public more out of habit than necessity, had smoothed at the edges where my fingers had rubbed it. The registry had become accepted, and Marcellus had published a small collection of border histories that included a page about the hollow. Tomas received a grant to repair stable roofs along the eastern road, and Captain Jory was named commander of a new unit tasked with diplomatic patrols. Keeper Oren taught me to read a different howl, one that marks seasons rather than threats. The wolves no longer felt like an omen, but like neighbors who sometimes knocked at night. Rhiannon remained a thorn. She withdrew from some public ceremonies, but not from private influence. Her power, which had been aimed like a blade, became something like weather, persistent and eroding. Lysander was sent to an outpost to learn leadership the hard way, and perhaps the distance will smooth his edge. The people at the borders, those who had once regarded me as an interloper, brought me small gifts: a cleft stone polished from the river, a scrap of cloth embroidered with a crossing map, a loaf baked in a way that tasted like a place. My mother arrived once, unannounced, and the reunion was small and fierce and full of the smell of rosemary and smoke. She looked around the hall as if cataloging the changes. Then she squeezed my hand and said, "So, you did not run." I understood then that being chosen had not only changed me, but set a path that others followed. If you felt this story hit a chord, if the idea of being yanked from your life and asked to become someone else stirred something, I want to hear one small thing from you. Tell me in the comments one word about what you would do if you were chosen for a life you never asked for. Keep it to a single word, like stay, run, fight, listen. I will read them and bring some of your choices into the next telling. Your single word will help build the next path. If you want to hear more about the politics, the rituals, and the hidden techniques I described, subscribe to the channel. There are deeper files and notes I can share, and your presence helps me tell these stories more often. When I look back now, from a place where the moonlight falls evenly on both the low and high roofs, I understand how small acts map onto large consequences. From the smell of wet fur and smoke to the carved bone in my palm, the necklace became a thread I could follow when I felt lost. The king who had once told me not to run stood with me in councils and at the edge of the world, and our vows became a practical set of tools to mend what power can break. The choice that night was not a theft of my life. It was an invitation to practice stewardship. If there is a final thing I learned, it is that identity is not only what you are given, but what you choose to build with what you have been given. Do not think this is an end. The hold changes slowly, like a tide that smooths a stone. Rhiannon may return with new strategies, territories may shift, and the wolves may one day ask us for favors that cost more than we can pay. But the small reforms, the registry, the tapestries of story that Marcellus keeps, these are bricks in a road that will take generations to complete. My mother's sapling behind the cottage grew into a tree whose branches now stand like a memory of perseverance. I have taken on duties that do not always feel like romance. Sometimes they are ledger entries and patrol routes and the quiet conversations with women who stitch during the long winter nights. Sometimes they are the pure, bright things like a laugh shared over stew. There are many ways my story could have gone. It could have ended in flight. It could have been swallowed by a rival's conspiracies. It could have been a footnote in a ledger. Instead, it unfolded into a work of tending. The king and I continue to choose one another each morning with small acts: a shared cup of tea when the light is blue, a letter left on a pillow that contains no politics, only a small joke, a hand placed on a shoulder in the council when words get hot. The pendant is still in my palm sometimes when I need to remember that home is not a place, but a collection of hands who know you. If this tale moved you, leave that single word below and help shape the next episode. If you want the behind the scenes on the rituals and the political maps, subscribe and we will walk them together. I will read your words and bring them into the next chapter. For now, under the same moon that watched me walk to that pool, I stand and say that choosing is less about being taken and more about choosing to stay. And while the wolves will always remind us that wildness exists, I have found there is a wildness in keeping promises that tie us to each other.